Okay, so now we're finally getting into some of the moral theories that assume that we have moral realism, which is to say they assume that there's a right or a wrong answer to what is morally obligated for us to do. So one of these theories, that's one of the most famous theories, is the utilitarian theory. So the principle of utility is the heart of the utilitarian theory, and this is the idea that when considering an action, we must choose the one that promotes the most happiness in those affected. So it's a fairly simple idea, but it ends up bringing up a lot of questions and having a lot of problems. The first question we might ask is, what is happiness? So if we're going to promote the most happiness, we need to know what happiness is. So one of the founders of this theory was Jeremy Bentham, and John Stuart Mill was another proponent of the theory who kind of came after Bentham, and he disagreed with him on his definition of happiness. Bentham had a pretty straightforward, simple-minded idea of happiness. He thought really any pleasure was a good pleasure, and any pleasure was as good as any other. So utilitarianism is supposed to be just about promoting as much happiness as possible, and he didn't have any particular regard of that one pleasure might be better than another pleasure. It was just had to do with the amount of pleasure, the certainty, the duration, the intensity, and so on. So this was good and bad, because really, I mean, you can see how there might be a lot of problems with this, especially if someone's idea of pleasure is going to hurt other people, or if somebody's idea of pleasure is just kind of like, let's say, pointless. That we're not going to privilege a higher pleasure over that pleasure. Any pleasure is equal. But interestingly, it also had the consequence that animal pleasures are equal to human pleasures. So really any creature that can experience pleasure or pain counts in this utilitarian calculus, which is interesting because, as we mentioned earlier, Kant, another famous philosopher concerned with ethics, did not think that animal pleasures counted at all. So this was kind of a radical view at the time as well, for that reason. So John Stuart Mill said, look, yeah, okay, Bentham, I like the idea of trying to get as much pleasure for as many people as possible, perhaps even animals, but, some kinds of pleasure are better than others. He didn't like the idea that an oyster could be happier than Socrates. And so he wanted to prove that some pleasures are better than others, but the way he did this, how are you going to prove that, right? How are you going to do it? And what he ended up doing was sort of doing what we talked about before as being perhaps a fallacy, which is deriving an ought from an is. So deriving a normative from a descriptive. And what he did then is said, look, something is more desirable if more people actually desire it. And of course, G.E. Moore pointed out that this runs afoul of the naturalistic fallacy, or the is-ought problem that we talked about earlier. Just because people actually desire something doesn't mean they should. So perhaps this isn't the best way of ranking pleasures. But it's difficult to see, if you don't do this, it's difficult to see how we're going to rank pleasures then. On the other hand, his view of happiness, John Stuart Mill's view of happiness, does capture the intuition that probably most of us have, that there is something better about certain kinds of pleasures than others. The fact that we feel guilt when we indulge in certain pleasures might tell us that, especially things like just being lazy. And we all sort of think that just being lazy and watching videos all day is perhaps less of a good kind of use of our time than, say, learning to play the piano or something like that. So, we do seem to think that there are different kinds of pleasures and that some might be better than others, but also they just might be different. So Bentham sort of said, well, okay, I get this, but I really just don't want to be in this business of ranking pleasures. So he came up with the idea that, well, we can capture the same idea with the idea of duration, so that it's a long-term pleasure involved in learning a skill or cultivating a relationship. It's not that it's a better thing in a sense than watching videos all day, but that in the long run it's going to make us happier. So it's still, perhaps some people think though that it seems to miss something to just say that it's better to say help grandma than it is to watch videos just because it will give us more pleasure in the long term. That still kind of seems like it's missing something. And the fact that that we feel guilty when we indulge in certain pleasures that are perhaps less productive might make us think that there's something besides duration going on here, just besides how long the pleasure might last. So one of the reasons why Bentham and Mill wanted to come up with this idea of utilitarianism was for social reforms, and this kind of shows how perhaps Mill was right that some pleasures are better than others. And he made the point, John Stuart Mill made the point that certain political moves, like trying to get women the right to vote, we could justify based on the idea of happiness, that there's sort of a good life that we could talk about, or human happiness that involves freedom and the ability to make decisions. And he took these laws and kind of looked at them from this perspective of happiness, and he was able to say why they were right or wrong based on this idea that he had come up with. So it ended up being useful as far as social reform, which is what he wanted it to do. And so again, it doesn't seem like a radical idea, but it kind of was at the time for various reasons. One is the fact that you could use it to try to argue for women's rights, which were not popular at that time. It was a good 100 years before women actually got the vote when he was saying this. So in a way it's a good theory, but it does have a lot of problems, and we'll talk about those next time.